up the telephone and dialed a few numbers. Drew watched him and listened, intrigued as to whom he might be telephoning. The inspector dialed the same long series of numbers he had in the Green Man and stood waiting for an answer. "Rank, number and position, please," an authoritative man's voice answered almost immediately. "Inspector, 99473, Scotland Yard, case 4199. I'm currently in Firestone Copse," the inspector said jovially. There was a pause. The line clicked and hummed. "Good morning, Inspector. I'm the operator who took your call yesterday. How can I help?" "Good morning. I'd like to run a trace, please." "Of course. From which number?" the operator asked. "This telephone number. All calls between Saturday midnight and 4 a.m. Sunday night." A short pause followed while the trace was made. The inspector took the opportunity to take out his notebook and pen. "No calls during that time." "Thank you. Now all calls for the last 24 hours. Another pause as the operator began his search. "He called 4678 last night at 9:30. That's his home number." The inspector began scribbling it all down. "He then called Biddlecombe Road's office," the man informed him. The inspector's interest was held. "How long was that one?" 15 minutes, the operator replied. The inspector scribbled his notes. "Can you put me through to that number? Can I talk to them?" he asked. "Of course. If you need anything afterwards, just hold the line, and when the other person hangs up, I will come back on." "Thank you." The inspector knew this, but liked that the operators always told him. He waited, and presently the drone of the dialing tone filled his ears. "Rhodes." The voice that answered was a little gruff. "Hello, I wish to ask somebody some questions about the road clearances on Sunday night. The person in charge, if possible." "I can help you there. What do you need to know?" The inspector sensed a tone of unease settle into the voice at the other end. "Oh, wonderful. Were there many trees to clear up on Sunday?" The voice coughed, and there was a pause as the person on the other end thought through their reply. "Well, what with the storm, we had both our vans out most of the night clearing trees and debris off the road." "I see. So you were busy most of the night?" "Yes, the conditions made things difficult to clear as well. It was mid-morning by the time they were back." "And did you receive many calls asking for trees to be cleared?" "Yes, I even received one from the sergeant at Firestone," the man mentioned as casually as he could. "My word, when did he call you?" the inspector asked, pleased to hear Banks' alibi backed up. "About 1:30, the man replied without hesitation. "I see. But they are all done now? The trees are all cleared?" "Yes," the man replied simply. "I am glad. And who would you be?" the man asked the inspector. "I'm calling from Scotland Yard. What was your name, please?" "Harold Barnes, head of roads," came the nervous reply. "Thank you." The inspector had been scribbling furiously the entire time. "Yes, that's all right. Will that be all, then?" Harold asked, anxious to get off the telephone. "Yes, goodbye." The inspector covered the mouthpiece with his hand, moved it away from his mouth, and turned to Drew. "Goodbye," Harold replied nervously. He hung up his receiver and the line went dead. "That was the man that Banks said he telephoned on Sunday night. He says Banks called him, but the call was made much later. So he didn't call to have someone else come and take care of the tree?" "No, at least not when he said he did. My guess is he pulled a favour with an old friend in an attempt to cover his tracks." The telephone clicked back into life. "Hello, Inspector." The operator came back on the line. "Hello, were you listening to the call?" "Yes," the operator replied. "Wonderful. Could you put me through to the people who drive the vans he mentioned?" The operator paused for a moment. "I could put you through to the garage where they are stored. Is that close enough?" "Yes, that would be marvellous, thank you." The line went dead for a moment, and then the dialing tone returned. In a depot, 10 minutes' drive from Harold Barnes' worried face, sat a fat, middle-aged, balding man in dirty blue overalls in the cab of a flatbed truck. He turned the key. The engine stammered into life, then began ticking over. He had just pulled himself out from under the truck, having been putting the engine back together from the oily floor. He lit a cigarette in celebration of his success, and just as he breathed out the first breath of smoke, a harsh ring began to shrill out from the office, telling him the telephone was ringing. He turned the engine off again and marched over to stop the bell from ringing. "Hello!" His voice was harsh and rough like smoke. "Ah, hello. Could I talk to the men who were clearing up the trees during the storm on Sunday?" the inspector asked respectfully. "Sunday night? You're having a laugh, aren't you?" the man mocked, and the inspector heard him take a drag from his cigarette. "You didn't receive any calls for falling trees?" "Yeah, of course we did. And when we clocked in on Monday morning, we went and cleared them." "But no one went out in the storm?" the inspector asked, just to clarify. The man sighed, beginning to lose his patience. "No, mate. Like I said, we were closed. You wouldn't get us clearing roads in weather like that anyway." The inspector paused. "Well, thanks for your time," he said, and the man hung up without saying goodbye to go and make a cup of absurdly strong tea. After a few seconds of dialing tone, the operator returned. "Anything else, Inspector?" "No, that would be all for now, thank you." "No problem. Goodbye, Inspector." The inspector hung up the receiver again, and the bell gave a short ping as it came to rest in the cradle. "Well, we certainly have a few things to ask Sergeant Banks about now." The inspector took a look around the room. "It would appear there is nothing more here of any interest. Perhaps we would have more luck at his home. Any idea where your superior lives?" "Of course, he lives where he's always lived, in the old farmhouse," Drew told him. "The old farmhouse? Is there a new farmhouse, or is it just an affectionate name?" the inspector asked. Drew smiled. "Yes, there is a new one. When Banks sold his farm, he built a new house for the new owner. He kept his and a little of the land around it." As he talked, the inspector walked up to the office, closing and relocking the door. "I'll take you there now," Drew offered, and led the way as they retraced their steps down the corridor. "Thank you so much," the inspector replied. "The questions are, will he be there, and if not, then where is he?" They went through the door out to the waiting room and back out onto the street without disturbing the desk constable, who looked up briefly from his book to watch them leave. Chapter 25. Banks awoke early, leaving his wife asleep in bed. He left the house without eating. He simply dressed and left. He drove through the dark morning. The town slept eerily in the early hours of the day. He arrived at Drew's house and parked a little way down the road where he had a good concealed view. Then he waited. After being questioned by the inspector the day before, he had decided not to speak to him again. For now, it would be easier to avoid him, only approaching when the time was right. A much deadlier plan had now entered his mind for the inspector. He had decided to follow Drew, whom he had heard was playing chauffeur to the man from Scotland Yard. Drew would lead him to the inspector, then he could keep an eye on them both. He also hoped there would be a moment to get the inspector alone. When Drew finally emerged, he looked fresh and ready in his uniform. Banks spat a few curses his way as he drove off, then trundled after him. He was in his own car, out of uniform. He followed him to the Swan and Dove, and waited on the road for him to emerge. A sinister grin spread across his face when he saw Drew drive away the inspector. His hunch at trailing Drew had paid off. He then followed them to the Swan and Dove. He would keep an eye on them both and see what they were doing. He hoped there would be a moment to get the inspector alone, but he knew the importance of remaining patient. His time would come. When Drew finally emerged, he looked fresh and ready in his uniform. Banks spat a few curses his way as he drove off, then trundled after him. He was in his own car and out of uniform. He followed him to the Swan and Dove and waited on the road for him to emerge. A sinister grin spread across his face when he saw the inspector emerge. He followed them to Nettlewood Station and watched the courier arrive and deposit the package into Drew's boot. He wondered what it could have been, what he was up to. He followed them into Firestone inconspicuously, and when they reached Firestone Station, he stopped his car a good distance away again. The police station sat near a T-junction, and after parking, he walked back up the road to the turning where the police station was situated. By this time, Drew and the inspector had entered. Banks continued walking past the road with the police station on it until he found a spot where he had a narrow view of the station around the corner. He climbed through a gap in Donald Fothergill's shrub at 42 Hodges Lane and waited patiently in his front garden, staring across the road, watching the station. The street was deserted. It was 10 minutes before Banks saw anyone out as Sam Johnston strolled past on the other side of the road. He didn't notice Banks. He paid more attention to his dog Boris, a boisterous Jack Russell. Boris sniffed the walls, cocked his leg at every lamppost, and scampered happily along at his master's side. After 10 minutes, the two men exited the police station. Banks watched them intently. They climbed back into their seats in Drew's car and drove away. Banks' mind began to divide as he wondered whether to continue following them or to check in at the police station. He decided he could check it later and hurried down to his car. He did a quick three-point turn and sped back away after them. He drove quickly but cautiously, eagerly wanting to find them but not eager to give his pursuit away. He concentrated his thoughts, his mind reaching out around the town and the copse looking for them. He felt the direction they were going in and where they must be headed. Banks' gut lurched as he pushed the accelerator a little harder. The houses rushed by, but as he approached his own house he slowed his pace to a crawl. When he saw Drew's car parked outside, his heart sank. He tried not to think of what his wife would be telling them, what she was showing them, what the inspector was seeing with his interrogating eyes. He swore at Drew for his assisting the inspector, but he wasn't surprised. Drew was smart. He had done well to get himself so integrated into the station. He saw now Drew's plan to become trusted. Banks swore at himself for using Drew so much. His mind screamed at him for letting him get close enough to find a body. He should have seen it would only be a matter of time. Finding them here allowed one thing to become clear. They were looking for him. They had already gained access to his house. His wife would no doubt be serving them tea now, showing them his study. It was wise of him to be wary with them. He knew why they were looking for him, and he didn't want to answer any questions. He cursed Drew again for not just telling him where he was on Sunday night. All this could have been avoided if he could have found Drew that night, but there was no trace of him anywhere in that terrible storm. Banks sat and watched the door. Now he knew where they were, and that he was their quarry. He began wondering if he had time to get back to the station. He wanted to assess what they might have seen, and wondered if they had taken anything. He rolled the thought over in his head until the urge to check became too great, and he abandoned his house, racing back the way he had come. Chapter 26. The old farmhouse was the last house along the eastern road. After selling the land and splitting the cottage away from the farm, the Copse had encroached and now surrounded the house. The farmland it used to be the homestead for was now cut off from it by trees. Beyond the trees, the remainder of the farm stretched out for miles around. The Banks house was set back along a drive with a huge front garden that had, in the not-so-distant past, been used to park farm machinery. It had once boasted stables and even a pig pen. When Banks had relinquished his farmer status in favour of a career in policing, he had converted the land to a lawn that rose in a shallow incline towards the house, bordered with a few flower beds that during the summer bloomed beautifully, but at this time of year sprouted only the dull branches of plants that awaited the spring. The stables had been converted to rooms that added to the rambling nature of the house. Drew parked his police car on the empty drive, and the two men approached the large red front door. A horseshoe hung on the left, and a handbell to the right. The building was white and single-storied. A thatched roof sat on top, which seemed to be pushing the squat house into the ground. As they approached the door, an older, but not old, lady opened it, drying her hands on a tea-towel. "Mrs. Banks, I presume?" the inspector asked as he approached her. "Yes," she replied, a little confused. Mrs. Banks recognised Drew's face. "Hello, Drew. Is everything all right?" "Hello, Mrs. Banks," Drew replied respectfully. "We're looking for Sergeant Banks. He's not at the station. We thought he might be here," the inspector continued for him. "I'm the inspector down from the yard." He held out his hand and she shook it, a little timidly, almost as if the mere act of shaking his hand would reveal to him some guilt she was unaware of. "Well, he's not here, Inspector. He left so early this morning I didn't see him go. He doesn't come home during the day," she replied, a tinge of worry slipping into her voice. "I see," the inspector replied. He paused in thought for a moment, determined not to allow this line of inquiry to become a dead end. "Would it be too much trouble to come inside? Perhaps we could gain an idea of where he is by looking at his diary, or at a calendar," the inspector asked casually. He did not want to cause her any concern as to his whereabouts, and wanted to gain her trust. He smiled comfortingly. She hesitated, wondering if there was anything her husband might be hiding that these two shouldn't see, then dismissed the idea with a shrug. "Of course. I'll show you through to his study. I'm sure you'll find something of use in there." The two men crossed the threshold and entered the house. It was warmly decorated, even if the decor was a little aged. This added to the feeling of homeliness the house exuded, making it feel lived in and welcoming. Though the building was quite large, the rooms inside were small but comfortable. As they walked down the hall on their way to the study, they passed a living room with sofas, chairs, a television, and an overfilled bookcase crammed into it. There was a dining room, with a large table squeezed into the small place, and a rustic, well-used kitchen. "I wonder where he could have got to," she asked them. "Did you try the Black Prince? He's quite pally with the landlord there, you know." "Is he? Well, perhaps we'll try there next," the inspector replied, as if he hadn't thought of it. When they arrived at the study, she opened the door and she pushed it wide open for them. It contained a large, dark wood desk covered in paper. It was not unlike the desk in the station in its content and appearance, though on this one Banks had made no attempt to hide the cigarettes or the whisky. The inspector could tell that Banks had not used the room recently. The smell of smoke wasn't fresh, and he guessed he had not been here for at least 3 or 4 days. He cast a quick eye over the paperwork. It was similar to what they had seen at the station, a few half-written reports, forms awaiting completion. No one said out loud what they were thinking. The room was a mess. The inspector rifled through the papers on his desk, opened a few drawers, but there was no sign of any diary. Mrs. Banks watched powerless. I can't see any diaries here." His eyes turned to the walls. "Any idea if he perhaps has a calendar?" They all looked about the room. The inspector had been the only one of them brave enough to actually enter. Drew and Mrs. Banks stood in the doorway as if held back. "I've been specifically told that I'm not allowed in here," Mrs. Banks told him from the doorway, "due to the sensitive information, you know, in his reports." She motioned towards the desk. "Indeed, very important to keep delicate details safe," the inspector nodded, eyeing the pile. "Is there anywhere else he might keep a timetable of his movements? Perhaps the bedroom?" the inspector suggested. "No, there's nothing in the bedroom. You could try the garage," she suggested. "The garage? Why would you want to check in there?" the inspector asked, pondering casually. Well, he spends a lot of time in there. You know what men are like, she answered with a nervous laugh. I guess it couldn't hurt to have a look. Please, lead the way. Relieved that they were leaving the study, she relaxed noticeably as she led them back through the front door and out to the garage. The larger main door at the front was shut and locked tight, so they tried the smaller door. This, too, was locked. Evidently your husband is a man who likes to keep himself to himself, the inspector pointed out. That's strange. I never come out here, so I always presume it was left open. I don't think I've got a key to this door. She thought for a moment. He must have it on his keys. He's got so many keys on there, I'm sure he has a key to every door in town. The inspector checked the thick garage door, giving it a gentle shove in case it was stuck, but it was definitely locked fast. He examined the lock, but it was beyond the ability of his picks. Without a key, they would be unable to access whatever was inside. Mrs. Banks looked worryingly at the door as she tried to calculate why he would be hiding something from her. Perhaps we could have a cup of tea and a chat. She thought for a moment of the loneliness of waiting for her husband to return home. Yes, please, come back in and I'll put the kettle on. Happy for the distraction away from the locked garage and back to the chores of everyday life, she led them back into the kitchen. Like the rest of the house, it was warmly decorated. Patterns of faded flowers adorned the old wallpaper. Pictures of family, recent and old, hung on the wall for happy reminiscences. The sides, the table, and the cupboards were all made of weathered oak. The inspector and Drew made themselves comfortable at the old table, while Mrs. Banks busied herself with fetching cups and making tea. This is a lovely home you have, Drew complimented, admiring the kitchen with its heavily laden shelves of homemade preserves, jars of herbs and spices. Why, thank you, Drew. It's too big for my liking nowadays. Lots of cleaning of empty rooms now the children have all flown the coop. She pointed at one of the pictures hanging on the walls. That's our son and his daughter. They live down by Plymouth. How delightful. Have you always lived in Firestone? The inspector asked. No, I'm from Nettlewood originally. Been here 36 years. We moved here when we were married. It's been in my husband's family for generations. She poured water into the pot and stirred. I believe it used to be the farmhouse, the inspector asked. That's right. When he got offered the sergeant's job, we sold the farm off, but we kept the house. You can see how it used to look in that one there. She stopped stirring and pointed at another picture on the wall with her spoon. This one showed the front of the property filled with horses, all stood on a dirt track. The house looked the same, but the surroundings of the picture were all foreign to the building now. So your husband has always lived here? Yes, and his father before him. How wonderful. Mrs. Banks began relaxing more into his company. Drew had noticed that the inspector had a demeanour that could relax any situation and bring anyone round to revealing what he wanted to know. He remained silent, allowing him to work. So does he ever talk about his policing? The inspector asked. No, not really, not that I ask. She began moving the fruits of her labour onto the table. Cups, teapot, and even a plate of homemade biscuits. I always ask how his day was, and what he's been up to, but he always says he can't talk about it. Why is that? The inspector asked, picking up one of the shortbread. Thank you, he added, taking a bite. Well, he says it's private, details of local crime and such. Such a shame. I find that bending someone's ear at the end of a hard day can lighten the weight of a stressful day. Does he ever show signs of stress? There are some things we need to tell people. How our day went, how we are feeling, and I would have thought the wife would be the ideal person. Well, yes, she trailed off as she remembered the locked garage. I wish he would tell me about it. He seems to have terrible dreams. A sure sign of a weary mind. Does he tell you about them? The inspector asked, accepting a cup of steaming tea from her. Thank you, he said again. No, when I ask, he says he can't remember them. I hear him in the night murmuring to himself. I can't tell what he's saying, but it seems urgent, like he's trapped or in trouble. She looked up suddenly, as if hearing something in the house. He talks to himself, too. I don't tell him I know that, and I don't tell no one else either, she informed them, as if there was an unspoken confidentiality between them. I hear him, sometimes when he's shaving. It sounds like he's talking to someone, but I only hear one voice. Does this worry you? The inspector asked, concern in his voice. A bit, but he's all right otherwise. It's like it's just his way. It's how he deals with things, and it seems to work, because he's all right otherwise. Drew watched her as she drifted into thought, properly considering his behaviour to herself for the first time. Drew was sure that this was due to the inspector allowing her to share her burden, asking her the right questions in the right way. The two men drank their tea quietly and allowed her to think. Is that why you're looking for him? She asked, seemingly coming to the decision that his behaviour wasn't normal. Has someone else noticed something and told you about it? No, no one else has mentioned anything, but he should be helping me with my investigation and I am unable to locate him. This is not the behaviour of a man concerned with finding the person responsible for leaving a dead body near his town. She thought for a moment. Unless he was the person responsible for the body being there, she reasoned absent-mindedly. The two men shared a surprised look. "Do you think your husband could be capable of something like that?" "Oh, no," she replied in his defence. "He's just overworked. He's very busy." The inspector and Drew shared another look. "Does he say where he goes, what he does all day?" "No, like I said, he never talks about it. Not with me. I always ask, but he never tells me much." "Well, I am sure he is fine and will be here again tonight. If he does come home, could you please contact me at Nettlewood Police Station? They can find me." Yes, I will," she said determinedly. She realised that she too deserved an explanation as to his whereabouts, and only the inspector was likely to get one out of him. "Well, Mrs. Banks, as we can shed no further light on your husband's whereabouts, we shall leave you in peace. Thank you so much for allowing us to look." At the news of their departure, Mrs. Banks stood politely. "Well, no problem, Inspector. I'm sure my husband will turn up. He can't have gone far." She was reassuring herself as much as the policeman. "Yes, I'm sure he will. As I say, please inform him that I have been looking for him, and contact me as soon as you see him." "Through Nettlewood Police Station," she repeated. "Indeed," the inspector smiled. With no further hesitation, Drew and the inspector left, wishing Mrs. Banks a good day on the doorstep. They walked back to Drew's car and climbed in. "Well, do you want to try the Black Prince like she suggested?" Drew asked. The inspector replied thoughtfully. "In good time, yes. Do you ever get the feeling that you're chasing your own tail?" Drew frowned. "Are you saying that Banks doesn't mean to be found?" he asked. "Yes, I wouldn't say this wild goose chase has been a complete waste of time." The inspector eyed the door of Banks's garage. "But I don't want to spend any more time looking for someone whom I feel is trying very hard not to be found. We will look, and we will find him, but perhaps not now." The inspector removed his notebook from inside his pocket and studied it. "Perhaps we could gain more of an idea as to where he might be by retracing his steps. We know where he was up until this morning. Perhaps now is the time to visit the mayor and ascertain what happened that night at his house." Drew started the engine. "Why the interest in Banks? It must be more than the business with my father," Drew stated. "It is. There were files missing from the cabinets at the station that weren't in his study. I can't think why he would hide cases, but I suspect as they were not in the study that they are locked in his garage. Not to mention that he gave you orders about the body on Sunday night that no decent officer would give," the inspector replied. "Do you think she's right about him being able to murder someone?" "Do you think Banks is a suspect?" Drew asked. "I believe he has a role to play in the body's appearance, though I'm not sure yet what that role was or the motives behind it. I don't believe Mrs. Banks knows any more about it than we are able to get out of her." The inspector lost himself for a moment as all the possibilities played out in his mind's eye, and his next move became obvious. "Let us visit the mayor, and see what occurred at his house on Sunday evening." Drew nodded, put the car into first, and they drove away. Chapter 27. Banks entered the police station through the front door, rushing past the constable reading his book, unlocking the door he guarded without disturbing him. He followed Drew and the inspector's steps back down the corridor to his office. He rattled the handle. It was still locked. He took out his keys, sorting through the bunch for the right one. Upon entering, he could tell immediately someone had been in there recently. Everything seemed to be exactly as he had left it. The drawers were all still secure. No item was out of place, yet the inspector's presence denied him. Banks followed his steps around the room, retracing his path, even his movements as if having them dictated to him. He knew that the worst thing the inspector was likely to have found in his office would be the bottle hidden in the bottom drawer, so his being here only disturbed him because he had been here. He had somehow gained access to his office, and now he had entered his house. He froze on the spot suddenly, as if hearing something. "I must! He's too close!" He suddenly spoke loudly out into the air. "No, you won't," he called louder, as if arguing with someone. He knew what he would have to do. He would find a time when the inspector was alone. Perhaps tonight he could sneak into his room. No witnesses, before any reports were filed. He raised his head again. "Then we will do the same thing to them," he replied to no one. He took a cigarette from the packet in the drawer and lit it with a crackling swan vista. He inhaled the first drag with a sharp intake of air and poured himself a scotch before he exhaled the smoke, satisfied. He reorganized the papers on his desk, took some more out of the cabinet and put them on top. When the cigarette was finished, he stubbed it out and lit another one. He put the scotch and the matches back in the drawer and locked it. He left the room with cigarette in mouth, locking the door again behind him. He hurried out of the station, the desk constable not once looking up from his book. When he was back in his car, he looked up into his mirror and said, very calmly, "I will. There will come a time," before he drove away back towards his house. Chapter 28. Drew drove his squad car down the road towards Firestone Copse, but took a left, heading north before they reached the town. The closer they got to the mayor's house, the thicker the roof of trees over their heads became. The roads thinned and became more difficult to traverse. "What can you tell me about the mayor?" the inspector asked Drew as they drove. "He provides all the mayoral duties, as you might expect. Opens fetes, judges vegetables. He attends the monthly council chamber meetings, though I've never attended myself, so I couldn't tell you what, if any, role he plays in them." "Well, but what about his private life? Anything you know about him outside of his official duties?" "Well, he drinks in the Black Prince occasionally on a social footing, but more often attends various dinners with members of the local council in various places around the county. They are very formal affairs. Apart from that, I couldn't really tell you much, I'm afraid." "What do you know about his relationship with Banks?" "That's something I've always puzzled about," Drew admitted. "Nothing I can think of that connects the two, other than in a professional capacity. I presume the sergeant of the local force and the mayor would be required to discuss matters together. Security, crime rates, but outside of this I'm not sure what they have in common." They turned down the private lane where the mayor lived, and a grand old house loomed into view ahead. "Is this the residence of all the mayors, or is this his own private house?" "As far as I know, this is his own house. He's been mayor for as long as I can remember, and he has always lived here." They pulled up on the gravel drive in front of the impressive front door. Huge and overbearing, the door was far from welcoming. It was as if the doors themselves warned them not to enter. Drew stepped out of the car and shivered against the cold and the feeling of trespassing. Whether the inspector shared his feelings was unclear as he stepped purposely out of the car, barely noticing the chill, and walked confidently to the door. Drew stepped up behind him, inspired by his confidence. The inspector pulled the bell cord, and from somewhere deep inside the house they could hear its distant ring. The men stood and waited patiently. The house stood in a clearing in the trees, its grounds protected on all sides from the long ancient branches by a low and ancient-looking red brick wall. Eventually the door was answered by the mayor, dressed in suit trousers, shirt, waistcoat and untied tie, but no jacket. Instead he wore an official-looking red gown over his smart attire. He looked rather affronted at the sight of a policeman at his front door. "Good morning, gentlemen." He eyed them up and down distastefully. "Is there a problem?" "No, sir. Sorry to bother you. I'm an inspector from Scotland Yard. I was wondering if I might ask you a few questions," the inspector asked with a polite smile. "Do you have a warrant?" the mayor asked immediately. "Well, I don't really need one. I'm just wanting to ask a few details." The inspector did not allow himself to become riled by the mayor's attitude. "Concerning what, exactly?" The mayor was offish and suspicious as to what they would possibly want to question him about. Someone of his stature was not used to being questioned by the law on his doorstep. "Well, as I hope you are aware, a body was discovered in the woods not far from here. As one of the leaders of the town, I wondered if talking to you might help me understand the community, and you could perhaps help the investigation by keeping the community calm in such difficult times." The inspector smiled a sycophantic smile. "Well, yes, of course." The mayor remained rather uppity, but bowed under the inspector's logic and compliments. "Yes, of course. Please come in. I'm afraid I'm just preparing to go out, so I can't give you very long." This seemed to be his excuse to them for his offish behaviour. However, no apology was forthcoming. The two men stepped across the threshold and into a large, cold, flag-stoned hallway. The mayor kept them there. He did not allow them to enter any further into the house. "So if you'll excuse me, I must dispense with the same questions I have to ask everyone," the inspector explained. "Please, go on, Inspector." The mayor, realising he was having to accommodate visitors on a professional level, had developed a slightly more welcoming tone. "Firstly, where were you Sunday night?" the inspector asked kindly, every part the guest, respecting the mayor's hospitality. "Well, I was here entertaining guests," the mayor replied. "I see. And who were these guests?" the inspector asked. "Well, there was Sergeant Banks, Constable Atkins, Charlie, and Dr. Sparrow." "And what did you all do?" "We played cards, drank port, smoked cigars, and reminisced on our old school days together," the mayor replied curtly. "What would you expect us to be doing? Scouring the streets for urchins to murder? Really, Inspector, we are pillars of the community. Were there any other witnesses to their being here? Perhaps your wife witnessed you all playing cards." "My wife? Oh no, my dear man. Card nights are strictly men only." "I see, of course. How silly of me. So the only people who can ascertain for certain that the five of you were here all night will be yourselves? Is that not enough, then?" The mayor's demeanour was slipping again, and he was becoming quite agitated. "The head of the local police force, the mayor, and the doctor do not hold enough authority for you? What is the meaning of these questions? Are you suggesting that we, are suspects?" "No, of course not," the inspector replied calmly. "And so what of Banks? How was his behaviour?" He moved swiftly on with the questions, not seeing a need to defend himself. "The same as always. He was amiable enough. He won a few hands, lost a few hands, and was delightful company as always. In other words, he was his normal self. He stayed later than the others, as he usually does, and we discussed the price of houses, maintenance of the park, general local issues that interest us." And how do you all know each other? We were all at school together, and have made the effort to stay in regular contact throughout the years. Everyone else we went to school with has, I believe, moved from Firestone a long time ago. In those days we had our own school. It has since closed due to declining numbers, of course. Would you mind perhaps writing me a list of everyone that was here Sunday night? The inspector asked. The mayor thought for a moment, then shrugged. Very well, he replied, apprehensively, not knowing why the inspector might need it. He entered one of the rooms that led off of the hallway through a heavy dark wooden door and returned with paper and pen. He leant against a table in the hall, holding a plant, and jotted down the names. Every action he made was defiant, from the crossing of the T's to the fullness of each stop. When the names were written, he tore the sheet from its pad and handed it to the inspector, who studied it briefly before folding it and putting it into his inside jacket pocket. Well, thank you for your time. Please don't allow us to keep you from your preparations any longer. Is that it? No more questions? He asked, surprised. He opened the door for them gratefully. No more questions for now, thank you, the inspector informed him. He turned to the constable. Well then, Drew, shall we be off? He raised his hat in farewell. Good day, he said, and they returned to Drew's car, leaving the incredulous mayor staring after them.